If you get the opportunity to take out.
Good morning, students. Mike Lilly. The class is Seminar on Criminal Justice. This is the 15th lecture this semester. And I hope you all have had a nice midterm break since all those things are closed. What we want to do today is to give a brief review for an upcoming test in this class day after tomorrow. A study guide for that test has apparently not yet been completed. I'm just trying to find it before I started class late. So we'll review for the test, and then I'll try to get that guide posted a little later after lunch, since of course you all know I have classes straight through till 12:30. So let's talk. The second test in this class has to do with policing, and we'll be covering the following articles. Article 7, 9, 10, and 12, and probably want to do number 11 too. I'll do some lecturing on number 11 here shortly. So 7, 9, 10, 11, and 12. All of which we lectured on at some length already and discussed, with the exception of the chapter on terrorism and local policing. In some ways, I've already commented on that chapter, but we'll make some further dues on it. The test itself will have 30 true-false multiple choice questions and probably 4 short answer essay questions. And this being an upper level class, you can't get out of here without having to write. Good or poor, whichever applies. Okay? And again, the true-false multiple choice will be graded on Scantron. The rest you'll write on the test questions itself. So please make sure you bring your number 2 leaded pencil to class. And let's see. Professor Chambers gave me a large load of banana flavored taffy, which I'm supposed to be getting rid of. So you can bring the sweet tooth too if you like that. Personally, if it doesn't go very well, if I can't get rid of it this week, I'm going to throw the rest of it away. But anyway, it's fresher than others. But anyway, so again, we'll have that test bright and early here on Thursday morning. Okay. Let's take a look at a few things that we're going to look at in these chapters for purposes of this test. First is Article 7, which is on page 121 in the text. We talked about that, I think, somewhat last class period or so. The chapter itself is on the issue of so-called Minneapolis experiment and its impact on policing. The issue being what level of intervention should law enforcement have in a domestic call situation? And of course, the response basically from the chapter is that attempts to necessarily replicate Minneapolis were not necessarily true, but basically all of which pointed to current policies in effect, which in essence demand that law enforcement make an arrest in a domestic violence call, whether or not the victim of the offense wants an arrest take place. And again, more recent studies certainly have shown that the incidences of post-arrest violence are certainly significantly less than if the offender is not incarcerated. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of the first being that oftentimes the offender in the case, and let's face it, that's usually the husband or the boyfriend, since incidences of women in domestic violence cases, arrest is somewhat small. But generally speaking, these situations are often the first true arrestable offense that the perpetrator of the abuse has, and thus it has a much more chilling effect on their future behavior than was previously thought. Even though police frequently talked about it, policies in the past, which again always seem to indicate, or at least the general view of many police departments was, that arrest at the first intervention would cause more harm. Now we know it's significantly less. Okay, much of this thing is about the test, the Minneapolis experiment, and various types of offenses, of separate controlled studies all seen as to whether or not the Minneapolis experiment could be replicated. Here on page 129 is a listing of the cities in which these follow-up tests were made: Charlotte, North Carolina; Colorado Springs, Colorado; Dade County, Florida; Milwaukee, Wisconsin; Omaha, Nebraska. That's something good for y'all to remember. Excellent test question. Okay, and again, here on page 132 is a discussion of the effects of the arrest and what exactly that meant or didn't. And of course, there's a conclusion at the end of the article. It's a somewhat technical article, I confess, but other than that, pretty good. Let's see, militarizing the police, that was on the last test. We look here, number 9, which again we talked about, the issue of suspicion and discretion, decision making during or traffic offenses. In my lecture last week, I commented on the fact that a new nationwide traffic study of well over 600,000 stops across the country, there's pretty conclusive evidence that one of the major reasons why law enforcement stopped, particularly in urban areas, stopped vehicles was the race of the driver, not and or the passengers, not necessarily the offense itself. Certainly, a search of the vehicle was a primary factor in that fact. So again, look at this chapter. The chapter itself, again, in this case, much more limited because this involves traffic stops in Savannah, Georgia, and a more recent study, again, nationwide, involving significant, involving cities across the country. I have to be honest, you kind of suspect in Savannah that the findings and conclusions of that study would show racial disparity issues because, of course, Savannah has a large African American population. And Savannah also has some very well-defined segregated areas. The so-called tourist area where people ride around in carriages and horse-drawn trolleys to view the old early antebellum homes and things. And the rest of the city, which for much of it, particularly the inner city, is pretty much has deteriorated over the years and basically is African American in content. I'm honest. I'm sure that Professor Sheila Holman Warmer can tell you more since she's originally from Savannah and the Savannah area. But I think there's little doubt from all of the data here that race plays a significant part as to who gets stopped in many parts of this country on traffic offenses. Interestingly enough, however, such data does not necessarily reflect traffic offenses given on the West Virginia Turnpike or other rural counties here in West Virginia. And there's a reason for that, and that is because, of course, this state has such a small African American population compared to, say, South Carolina or North Carolina or Northern Virginia. The whole state of West Virginia has roughly 5%, I think it's 5.2% African American population, much of which is centered here in the southern coal fields. You go into other areas in the state and basically, to use a bad pun, much of it is so-called lily white. In other words, there's not a whole lot of minorities around. It's not uncommon to find high schools in the state of West Virginia in which there might not be any blacks. In fact, even here in Mercer County, one of our 3 high schools has something like a 2% African American population. That's the basketball team. Anyway, our arrest data doesn't seem to indicate these issues. But that's, again, is not to say that elsewhere in the country we don't have such questions. So the real issue, therefore, really is, are these stops based on racial profiling? In other words, do police make these traffic stops simply because and only because the race of the driver, or are there other factors involved, etc. And these are things I think you want to look at this and talk about. Now, West Virginia does have a racial anti-profiling statute on traffic offenses, and I think pretty much by and large our state police do. Remember, of course, I should also comment as far as the West Virginia Turnpike is concerned, a special detachment of the West Virginia State Police patrols our turnpike. I think there are 6 officers. They even have specially marked patrol cars. And they are, that's basically all they do is traffic detail up and down the 88 miles of the turnpike. So those statistics are pretty easy to come by. I really am more than surprised we haven't seen any better research studies from here in West Virginia about turnpike arrests, but it is an issue. Okay, let's move on to Article 10 on policing, immigration, federal laws, and local police. Again, we discussed the issue with law enforcement. When the article was written, the concept of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states was unknown. And of course, the current conflict between the President Trump and California and certain other states regarding border security had not really come into play. My comments again, the state of California basically has declared itself a sanctuary state, and its legislature has attempted to tell all law enforcement in the state not to cooperate with customs and border enforcement authorities. Whether or not that will continue to hold, I don't know. Certainly there's more than one large city in California, LA, San Francisco, and San Diego, all of whom declared themselves sanctuary cities and have forbidden by local ordinance any cooperation regarding immigration enforcement. And so this chapter, which talks about how law enforcement should cooperate, has been turned on its ears, and that is, why should they? What about when law enforcement does not cooperate? And again, you can look at this study just to see again about this particular issue, and I think there's a little doubt that it's a major issue anywhere along the Mexican border area. However, we don't have such an issue along the Canadian border, which of course is far larger and far longer than the Mexican border. Nor do we have, in most areas, don't have any kind of security about the border. There's some changes that have taken place over the years. Generally speaking, if there is a border crossing, you now have to show a passport. Didn't used to. But by and large, the issue of immigration, illegal arrests, etc., we don't have hordes of Canadians trying to get into the U.S. Indeed, Canadian authorities would say it's the reverse. We have too many Americans trying to get into Canada. Except, of course, I guess, certain places. For instance, Niagara Falls, which has a large gambling casino there on the Canadian side. They want Americans coming across so they can lose money in the casino. Anyway, look again at this article about the issues. And what should be police responsibility in notifying immigration authorities about immigration violations. And the central key issue here in the U.S. that we have right now is that, again, more and more police departments are being told by their ruling city or county boards not to have any kind of cooperation whatsoever rather than reverse. And I know in San Francisco there's a major question being told right now that if a person is here illegally or undocumented and they're arrested for a crime, should the California authorities tell ICE or Customs and Enforcement Agency about that arrest so that person can be deported? And again, that's a big issue. Finally, I guess I would also comment that a lot of this has to do with the fact that throughout the border states and all of California, we frequently see attempts by federal authorities to raid various companies who they believe are hiring large numbers of illegal immigrants. And so that if they're found out, they can then be taken into custody and be deported. And again, that's a question. Oh, on the arrest issue, one of the things that really has been criticized, particularly I think in California, is the fact of ICE agents waiting outside courtrooms in various courthouses in California to seize people who had been stopped by the police for maybe minor traffic offenses or whatever, and to deport them on the spot. And I know, again, in a number of places in California, their presence in courthouses is now being prohibited because they don't want them to arrest people who have given a speeding ticket and going to pay a fine and then having them being deported. The issue there really is that this seems to be a real scare tactic, which we're not looking at. Okay, I'm going to skip chapter 11 momentarily. Chapter 12, we have already a lot talked about. Again, police stress, its effect in law enforcement, the cop-to-cop program talked about on page 230, and the fact that the cop-to-cop program is pretty successful where it is, but it's not universal. As I've stated in class too many times, police and law enforcement, police departments want to handle their own problems. There's certainly a major lack of any kind of transparency about police disciplinary situations. They're intentionally kept from the public because of the belief that law enforcement doesn't want the public to think they're, that they have major issues inside, and they desire to prevent public criticism of various types of law enforcement issues. But there is no question that in law enforcement circles, several things are problematic. One, an extremely high divorce rate. Two, an ever-increasing suicide rate among law enforcement officers. who simply are unable to deal with the PTSD effects of constant stress and constant exposure to situations which for others might be somewhat different. I think I commented here that we used to not talk about PTSD other than returnees from Iran from Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan. But there's been too many studies again talking about similar exposure in law enforcement on a daily basis, and therefore problematic. There's little if any doubt that law enforcement is a stressful job, and that oftentimes that stress isn't dealt with very well. Now, we in West Virginia, of course, as I already said, we do have a voluntary organization of psychologists and psychiatrists in the state whose job is to go to police departments where there has been an active shooter problem, particularly an officer is involved in having shot and wounded and or killed another person. But other than that, we don't really have the type of stress reduction programs that I think we need in order to keep some of the coping problems down. One other thing I think probably should be mentioned as we're looking at reviewing, one, there is a fairly high rate of domestic violence of law enforcement. Once again, something not talked about a lot. And two, that there's a high rate of substance abuse among law enforcement of alcohol. It's always interesting to me, no matter what kind of police drama you see on television, from whatever side it's directed from, one of the things that always is true is as soon as police officers get off the job, according to television, where's the first thing they do? They go to a local bar and start drinking. Do they go home to their families? Not necessarily so. Of course, a lot of police officers are portrayed as being single, which could be true, so again, given the high divorce rate, but I don't think that's an issue. The issue is the way to unwind from the stressful day of law enforcement to go to a bar and, I didn't say get intoxicated, but start drinking. I've had alcoholics in my family, and I can tell you right now that the one thing that truly leads to alcohol addiction is not the occasional party, but rather the daily use of alcohol as an unwinding tool from stress. Used to be when families, the husband would come home, what would happen, he and the wife would have a cocktail before dinner. Be surprised how many times that led to alcoholism. Well, the same would go in law enforcement. If that's what you do every night when you get off the job, is go have a drink at a bar, it's not going to be too long before you're going to have a problem with it. So there's a pretty high issue of that. Now, other drug abuse does happen in law enforcement, and we do see it every now and then. But the main issue with police in dealing with stress is not narcotics, but rather alcohol. And I'm honest, it's one of the things about this chapter really doesn't talk about is too much about the high rate of divorce in police departments and the fact that normally speaking in most police departments, 50 to 60% of all officers are divorced. And that's a pretty high rate, pretty high statistical rate. And by the way, not just once divorced, but often multiple divorces, simply because policing is such a very stressful issue about that. All right, let's flip back here to talk a little about terrorism. That's Article 11. One of the things that happened after 9/11, and it's hard to realize how far back that is these days, since we're going on, 18 years after the event. Seems like only yesterday I was lecturing a class in business law in the IVN Center, and all of a sudden they came in and cut in the middle of my lecture to show the planes having crashed into the World Trade Center. In fact, I think we saw the second one crash as the class was watching. But it's been a long time ago. Anyway, September the 11th, 2001 is a high water mark as far as law enforcement goes, because suddenly, for major law enforcement agencies in this country, the shift from fighting crime to fighting terrorism takes place. Particularly the FBI and certain other federal law enforcement agencies all of a sudden have to begin focusing on preventing future terrorist attacks here in the United States. And so they have to change their focus. The FBI remains today principally not a crime-fighting organization, as television might have you believe, but principally an organization which is involved in trying to see whether or not there are domestic terrorist plots. Another major event that occurred after that, and we're paying the price for it now, is that particularly with the FBI, their focus on terrorism, and FBI and NSA and others, their focus on terrorism was basically terrorism from the Middle East, Salafist jihadists coming out of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, of course, and other places. The rise of Al Qaeda, which of course carried out the 9/11 attacks, meant lots of scrutiny involving those particular countries. Salafism, of course, is the very extreme fundamentalist religion, basically followed in Saudi Arabia and later exported into Muslim communities around the world. And jihadism, in this case, basically is that followers of this particular concept of Islam believe that the world is filled with infidels and they must assault and attack them. Al Qaeda was bad enough, but ISIS, of course, was far more extreme in its beliefs than other forms of Al-Qaeda. Indeed, in Syria, ISIS starts when its leaders are thrown out of the Al-Qaeda movement, again claiming that they were not pious enough. So our focus then is on this particular area and the messages coming over the internet, social media, recruiting efforts at trying to get Americans to go to Syria and fight for the cause of ISIS, to set up this mythical country they wanted to create, a so-called caliphate, which basically meant a return to 14th century Islamic empires in the Middle East. And of course, that certainly was the goal of ISIS. ISIS at one time probably had well over 40,000 fighters in its ranks. Now we know they're down to several hundred, still fighting, trying to stay alive in an area about the size, from what it looks like, of the parking area down here at Bluefield State and Maintenance area. It's not a whole lot bigger than a pit. And they're all there fighting to the death. ISIS has gone from ruling between 1/3 and 1/2 of the country of Iraq and significant large parts of Syria into this small area today. But ISIS created its own governmental concepts, etc. And so too often, therefore, law enforcement is looking at particular types of extremism coming into this country, and to be blunt, ignoring the other type of extremist terrorist organizations in this country, and that is the far-right white supremacist movements, of which we have had, of course, our own share. Prior to September the 11th, the single largest terrorist event in this country is Timothy McVeigh blowing up the Murray Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing hundreds of people. I'm honest. Interpretation of Islam was the furthest thing from Timothy McVeigh's mind, or of his buddy, Mr. Nichols. So, as the focus shifts to Middle East terrorism, much of the white extremist movements seem to be forgotten or not quite covered as well as they should have been. We should have looked at them, and we are now, but that's only because we are seeing again flare-ups here in the United States of a number of white supremacist-based terrorist actions in this country today. While I'm on vacation in Florida, what happens? We see American-style white nationalist extremism having been exported to, of all places, New Zealand, where we have, over 50 people killed in attacks on 2 mosques by white supremacist gunmen, all of whom apparently got their inspiration from America. We're probably going to see lots of more repercussions from those attacks, since the Islamic jihadists are now calling for worldwide retribution for the massacre down there. Apparently there are other groups We're probably going to be looking at, again, more copycat types of attacks here in the United States on American mosque. I wouldn't be surprised if we do have more of that, but all of which has to do with this issue, terrorism. And of course, I talk more about this in my terrorism class, which I will be teaching again next fall. But basically, the question is raised by this article is simply the point and the problem of policing in U.S. citizens going from not ever even thinking about most terrorist acts. They're generally left up to the FBI or to AFT agents or others, suddenly having to focus on the question of what do we do about terrorism. And the focus, as you can see from this chapter, is quite frankly, lots of monitoring of phone conversations, etc. Lots of preparations for some kind of siege mentality in police departments. Large creation of SWAT teams to deal with future terrorist attacks, having to worry about different things, and particularly having to focus on various immigrant populations, which were perceived as possible breeding grounds for increased terrorist activity. Now, understand, therefore, that anywhere where you had significantly large Muslim immigrant populations, such as Milwaukee with its Somalians, in and around Milwaukee, such as other areas, suddenly police are focusing on these communities because of the fear that they're all terrorists in action. So there's a lot of discussions in this chapter 11, article 11, on how local police should respond to the question about terrorism. Is it the major threat that's talked about in this article, that's 2006, or is it basically trying to tell law enforcement to look only at Salafist jihadism rather than looking at other forms of domestic terrorism?
Is it like jihadism? Is that like closer to like the Sunni?
Yes.
Or like the Shiites, one of them.
Of course, you know there's two main branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia. Al-Qaeda and ISIS both are offshoots of the Sunni faith. And indeed, at least in the Middle East and Afghanistan, it's quite common for Sunni-based terrorist elements to carry out their suicide bombings and other attacks on Shia religious sites. We certainly know during the American occupation of Iraq, a number of Shia sites were blown up by Sunni extremists in order to foment conflict between the two sects. Again, Sunni extremism certainly is nothing to trifle with, but my comment, at least on this lecture, is that we also have to look at homegrown, far right-wing extremism. The neo-Nazi movement, of course, has come back somewhat strong in this country. Although I find it particularly humorous that one of the major, well, larger neo-Nazi movements suddenly now has an African-American leader, like Black Klansman in real life, I guess. That, of course, is based on a book, Black Klansman, the movie, based on a real life intervention in which an African-American police officer again infiltrated the Klan. However, yeah, extremism is still with us. We still have armed militia who are awaiting, I guess, Armageddon in this country. And I'm not necessarily talking about survivalists, although that seems to be a big part of their faith. So even though Franklin Pierce is not with us anymore, that doesn't mean that we are not having a revival of these events. So I could give you a long list and litany of all of the different examples of white extremist attacks, but let me simply say we've had more than one, and somewhat recently. For example, the attempt attack by an individual who became convinced by right-wing media, including Breitbart and others, that Hillary Clinton was running a sex ring out of a pizza restaurant in Arlington, Virginia. He goes in right armed with guns to shoot the place up. And guess what? It's just a pizza restaurant. There's no secret tunnel leading to an underground cavern where women were kept in cages and sold into slavery. It was all a myth, but he believed it. The Pulse nightclub shooting is a good example, again, of a terrorist act. No, not based on Islamic jihadism, but based on LGBT fears and profiles. We see more and more of these things happening. And so I guess my real answer is that law enforcement has a difficult problem. Which do you deal with most? And I think the real answer is that what we're going to have to deal with most in the future is probably homegrown terrorism, rather homegrown American style extremism, rather than necessarily from the Far East. Of course, remember, ISIS may be down, but it's not out. There's still thousands of foreign fighters in Syria and in Iraq, which could recreate the organization. Those videos are still out there, and they're still influencing people in this country to do terrorist acts every day, or to think about terrorist acts every day. So again, look here at the various things talked about in this chapter about how to deal with foreign terrorism. Excuse me, foreign and domestic terrorism. And the fact that law enforcement and police have to even consider it. Their mission is therefore not just local crime. So I think I've commented on in other classes. One of the largest single anti-terrorism activities in this country is the New York City Police Department, which has branch agents throughout the world. France, Netherlands, Belgium, all looking again at perhaps terrorist attacks aimed at New York City. So we do have these things, we do have these functions which have come into play, and we do have to look at them. Well, it looks like it's about time to close this class, so Let me again say, test Thursday. As far as I know, I'll try to have a short study guide posted a little later today, this afternoon. And then we'll go from there. With that in mind, I'll see you all on Thursday. Come ready to have some fun. With that in mind, I'll see you all then.